Good evening. We welcome you to the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. In its fourth season, the Beacon Salon Speaker Series at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida, is the institution's flagship community outreach program. The Speaker Series convenes speakers, educators, authors, and entertainers from Florida and around the country to educate, edify, and entertain by exploring history, waxing poetic, delving into popular culture, and clinching the political third rail. The series channels its ethos from the French salons during the Enlightenment. Citizens of all social classes and genders would gather around to comb through intellectual ideas. The Salon Speaker Series honors Beacon's duty as an institution of higher learning to uplift the community in which it operates, spark engagement, and sow seeds of conversation and discovery. So let's learn about tonight's speaker. Garrett Graff is a magazine journalist and historian who served as editor of Washingtonian and POLITICO. His books include Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die, and The Threat Matrix, the FBI war in the age of global terror. Please stay with us after the lecture for a Zoom webinar where you can ask Mr. Graff questions. There still is time to register for the webinar. Visit beaconcollege.edu/salon. And now, the Beacon Salon Speaker Series is delighted to welcome Garrett Graff.
Good evening, Beacon College. I'm Garrett Graff. Thank you, Daryl, so much for that introduction. I'm very sorry that due to travel restrictions, I am not there in person, but I am really excited to have the opportunity tonight to speak with you and talk a little bit about 9/11 and answer your questions. I'm going to start by reading a short chapter from my book, The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11, which follows 480 Americans as the day of September 11th, 2001 unfolds, morning to night, coast to coast. The book is made up of 64 small chapters, each told in the voices of the people as they experienced that day. And so I'm going to share with you a chapter about air traffic control as they begin to understand what's taking place in the skies over New England. Peter Zaleski, air traffic controller, Boston Center, Nashua, New Hampshire. When American Airlines Flight 11 came to me, the pilot said, "Boston Center, this is American 11, climbing to flight level 230. I called him many times. American 11, how do you hear? American 11, this is Boston Center. Do you hear me? I'm calling, and I'm like, my God, they must be drinking Dunkin' Donuts coffee up there. Honestly, that's what I was thinking. Then there are these transmissions. The first transmission from the aircraft, it's garbled to me. I don't understand it. Then there was a second one, a voice. I remember him saying, "Nobody move, please. We're going back to the airport." I will never forget that feeling up the back of my neck. It's like this adrenaline or something. I felt fear. I'm like, oh my God, the plane's been hijacked. Colin Scogans, airspace specialist and military specialist, FAA, Boston Center. I came in about 8:25 that morning, and as soon as I walked to the front door, someone came to me and said there was a hijack going on. We'd worked hijacks in the past, and I wasn't that concerned. It was usually uneventful. Peter Zaleski. I yelled at the supervisor, "John, get over here. This plane's been hijacked." "Absolutely." I go, "It's Middle Eastern voices. Positive." I could tell by the second time. I'm used to working Egypt Air, Saudi, Turkish, all of them. It's Middle Eastern voices. Colin Scogans. Mohammed Atta, the hijacker, the pilot on American 11, the lead terrorist, stated something about more planes, that they had more planes. It was definitely plural. That's when things really started to ramp up. Ben Sliney, National Operations Manager, FAA Command Post, Herndon, Virginia. I was the National Operations Manager on 9/11. That is a position located in the Washington area that has overarching authority over the nation's airspace. That was my charge, the safe and efficient operation of the nation's airspace. Colonel Bob Marr, Commander, Northeast Air Defense, Rome, New York. There was a huddle of people around one of the radar scopes. I saw the huddle and thought, there's got to be something wrong. Major General Larry Arnold, Commander of the 1st Air Force, NORAD, Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida. We had a major North American air defense exercise that morning, a command post exercise. There was a team of people who introduced scenarios that you have to react to and respond to. As we were winding up the briefing, my executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Duckett, handed me a slip of paper. It said Bob Marr had called and there was a hijacking in the Boston area. Ben Sliney. My experience with hijackings and our protocol was that we cooperate. Lieutenant Colonel Don Deskins, Mission Crew Commander, Northeast Air Defense, Rome, New York. At this point, our mindset was the 1970s vintage hijack. We didn't have a huge concern that this plane was going to crash. I said, Bob, go ahead and scramble some aircraft. Major Joe McCready, F-15 pilot, Otis Air Force Base, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. A scramble order was issued. I ran to our jets. I started up. I realized we did not have any weapons. They had filled our jets with gas, and even though we were Winchester, which means we had no weapons, we took off. Lieutenant Colonel Tim Duffy, F-15 pilot, Otis Air Force Base. When we took off, I left it in full afterburner the whole time. We were supersonic going down to Long Island, and my wingman, Nasty, that's Major Dan Nash, he called and he said, hey, Duff, you're super. And I said, yeah, I know. Don't worry about it. I just wanted to get there. Colonel Bob Marr. At Mach 1, it would take them 16 minutes to get there. That's 10 miles a minute. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Nisipany, Mission Commander, Northeast Air Defense. Almost simultaneously, we brought in more surveillance technicians to look at the scope. Staff Sergeant Larry Thornton, Northeast Air Defense. The area was so congested, the hijacked flight was incredibly difficult to find. We were looking for little dash marks in a pile of clutter on a two-dimensional scope. Master Sergeant Joe McCain, Northeast Air Defense. We picked up a search track going down the Hudson Valley, straight in from the north toward New York. The plane was fast and headed in an unusual direction, with no beacon, no transponder. We watched that track until it faded over New York City. Lieutenant General Tom Keck, Commander, Barksdale Air Force Base, Shreveport, Louisiana. We were in the midst of this big annual exercise called Global Guardian. They loaded all the bombers, put the submarines out to sea, put the ICBMs at nearly 100%. It was routine. You did it every year. The captain said, "Sir, we have an aircraft that hit the World Trade Center." I started to correct him, saying, when you have an exercise input, you have to start by saying, I have an exercise input. That way it doesn't get confused with the real world. Then he pointed me to the TV screens in the command center, and you could see smoke pouring out of the building. Like everyone else in aviation that day, I thought, how in a clear and a million day could someone hit the World Trade Center? This book grew out of a project that I started in 2016 for the 15th anniversary of 9/11, an oral history of being aboard Air Force One with President Bush on 9/11. As you may know, President Bush started the day in Sarasota, Florida. He was doing an education event at Emma Booker Elementary School, and then was rushed aboard Air Force One. It raced into the sky, and he was eventually taken to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, then on to Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska, and finally returned to the White House at the end of the day. It's been a moment that has always fascinated me as a journalist and a historian for the way that the President of the United States, on the most important day in modern American history, was hidden aboard Air Force One, 8 miles in the sky, for the first 8 hours after the attack. And so I went out for that 15th anniversary and interviewed 28 of the people who were with him that day, from White House Chief of Staff Andy Card, Karl Rove, the White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, Captain of Air Force One, Colonel Mark Tillman, the fighter pilots who escorted him around the country that day, the press who were on board, the security team, the Air Force technicians who were running comms aboard the plane that day. And the piece published for September 11th, 2016 in Politico magazine. And the reaction to that piece, which was called "We're the Only Plane in the Sky," a reference to Air Force One on its final leg of that journey back from Nebraska to Washington after all of the other commercial airliners in the country were grounded. The reaction was overwhelming. Most of you probably don't realize this, but as a journalist, as a writer, most pieces that you do in life get very little reader feedback at all. You can write pieces that you're incredibly proud of, that you've spent an enormous amount of time on, and you might get 3 or 4 notes from readers. The reaction to this, though, was tremendous. It became the most read story in the history of Politico magazine, and I got hundreds of letters and responses on social media to it. There were 2, though, that stood out in my mind. The first was from a veteran, a mother, who had 2 children. They were 7 and 9 at the time. And she told me that she had printed out my article and set it aside so that when her children were old enough to read, she would be able to explain to them why mommy had left them to go off to war after 9/11. There was another response from another soldier, an Army veteran. He was younger. He had been in middle school on 9/11. And he told me that he had done 3 tours, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, but that he had never really understood the trauma that the nation experienced on 9/11 until he saw the day through President Bush's eyes in my article. And the reaction from both of those people just kept rattling around in my head in the months after that article was published. And I was wondering sort of what it must be like to grow up in a world where every day American life in your world has been shaped by 9/11 in ways big and small, but to have no emotional attachment to that day. And so I set out to try to capture the emotional experience of 9/11 through the oral history, through the words of people who experienced it and lived that day. Because I think one of the disservices that we do in teaching history, in teaching 9/11, is that the story that we tell in history books, the ones that you have read in your textbooks, is a neater and cleaner and simpler version of what happened on 9/11 than the day that any of us actually experienced. The story that we tell you is that the attacks began at 8:46 that morning, that there were 4 planes, Shanksville, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, that the whole thing was over 102 minutes later at 10:29 with the collapse of the North Tower, the collapse of the Second Tower. But if you were alive on 9/11, that's not the day any of us actually experienced. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks were over. We didn't know how many planes there were. And we didn't know what came next. And I think one of the challenges of history is that simply talking about the facts of 9/11 doesn't account for how and why the nation reacted to 9/11 in the way that it did. That when you look at the fact from now that Al-Qaeda did not successfully attack the United States homeland in the 18 years after 9/11, it seems like in many ways that the US reaction was a dramatic overreaction. But that's not the way that any of us felt on 9/11. That 9/11 was characterized by fear, by trauma, by chaos and confusion, and most of all, the fear of what came next, the wonder of what would unfold on the afternoon of 9/11. What would happen on 9/12? What would happen in October? What would happen in 2002? And so my goal with this book was to capture the way that the day unfolded for those who lived it, not the facts of the day, but the experience of the day. And one of the ways that the writing history and studying history in that way changes the way that you think about that day is it allows you to understand a bunch of things that are not immediately clear in the way that we talk about 9/11 normally. The first is it allows you to understand just how much the country changed on 9/11, just how innocent America actually was on the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. We say so often, you have probably heard so often in your life, 9/11 changed everything, but we forget just how much 9/11 actually changed. And you see that in what to me is the most interesting moment of 9/11, which is the 17 minutes between the first crash and the second crash, 8:46 in the morning to 9:03. In that moment, you see all of the nation's innocence. One of the most striking quotes in the entire book to me comes from Peter Johansson, ferry captain for the New York Waterways ferries, one of the passenger commuter ferries in New York Harbor that morning, who talks about watching that first crash from his ferry as he comes across New York Harbor, pulling into Wall Street Terminal, and every single passenger on his ferry gets off and walks into Lower Manhattan, even as papers and debris from that first crash flutter down around them on the streets. And that there's not a single person that morning on his ferry who sees that crash and says, you know what, this just kind of seems like it's going to be a weird day. I think I might go work from home for the rest of the day. Instead, everyone proceeds on into New York, assuming that this is just the kind of weird stuff that happens in New York. And you see that across the country. You see that reaction on Capitol Hill. Brian Gunderson, the chief of staff to House Majority Leader Dick Armey, he talks about walking into the office that morning, and every congressional office has a TV in the reception area playing cable news. And that morning, the crash happened at 8:46. It was the final minutes of the morning shows. Most TV channels were live, carrying the burning footage of the World Trade Center by 8:49, 3 minutes later. So Brian Gunderson walks in to his office that morning to go to his 9 a.m. staff meeting, sees the World Trade Center on fire, and proceeds into his meeting. He says, "I thought it was going to be like a bad school shooting, the type of thing that dominates national news but doesn't fundamentally change anyone's day." In Florida, President Bush gets word of the attack and talks to his national security advisor, Condi Rice, back at the White House. They talk about what a weird crash it is. They have the same reaction that effectively everyone in America had that morning. It was probably a small plane. Maybe the pilot had a heart attack. Maybe the plane was having mechanical problems. Maybe it was an air traffic control accident. It's just weird. Condi Rice goes on into her 9 a.m. staff meeting. President Bush walks into that classroom at Emma Booker Elementary School. At the FBI, Robert Mueller, that was in his first week on the job as the director of the FBI. And every morning at 8 a.m., the FBI in that first week was trying to give him briefings on the FBI's biggest cases. So that morning at 8 a.m., Tuesday, September the 11th, Bob Mueller had actually sat down for his first briefing on Al-Qaeda and the bombing of the USS Cole the previous year. 49 minutes later, an aide interrupts to tell the room about the crash, and Bob Mueller, the FBI director, sitting in a briefing on Al-Qaeda, looks out the window and says, "How on earth could a plane have hit the World Trade Center on such a crystal clear blue day?" Terrorism was not the top of anyone's mind until 9:03 and that second crash. It's only then that America begins to understand that it's under attack. What you see unfold over the course of the rest of the day from there is this remarkable improvisation by regular Americans, by the military, by rescue personnel, and by the top government officials of the country, all of whom find themselves tackling a crisis larger, more confusing, and scarier than anything that they had ever lived through before. And part of what is so fascinating about coming to understand how that morning unfolds is you begin to see these stories that, if they had happened on any other day in modern American history, would be among the most interesting things that have ever happened in modern American history. And yet that morning don't even rank among the 10 or 12 biggest stories of the day. So there's three stories, three vignettes from that morning that I want to share about sort of the remarkable work that that Americans did at all levels of the country. The first is the incredible reaction by air traffic controllers. I read that small chapter about the 8 a.m. hour. Ben Sliney, who you heard from in that chapter, he was the national operations manager, but moreover, he was actually in his first day on the job as the nation's national operations manager for the FAA. And in his first 90 minutes on the job, he gives two orders that no American has ever given before or since. After that second crash, he gives a nationwide ground stop. That is, any plane that is not yet in the air has to remain on the ground. Then, after the crash of the third plane into the Pentagon at 9:37 that morning, he issues a second order, an unprecedented order that he's not sure that he has the legal authority to issue. Land everything now. And air traffic controllers across the country begin to put on the ground the 4,500 planes that are in the air at that moment across the country. 4,500 planes being redirected to the closest airport that they can land at, regardless of their destination and regardless of whether the airport is in any way prepared to receive them. Now, we sort of only ever hear about like the tiny sliver of this story, which is the 38 planes forced down in Gander, Newfoundland, the transatlantic flights that land in Newfoundland that make up the backdrop for the Broadway musical Come From Away. And that those planes end up being on the ground in Newfoundland for basically from Tuesday through Saturday, and a town of 9,000 people absorbs 7,000 transatlantic passengers into Gander, Newfoundland, with just a few hours and in some cases minutes notice. Across the country, Ben Sliney and the other air traffic controllers, they put 750 planes on the ground in the first 10 minutes after that order goes out at 9:42 that morning. And over the course of the morning, sort of one of the things that you see there play out is the extent to which we didn't know that there were only the 4 hijacked planes. Well into the afternoon, the government believed that there might be a dozen or even 24 hijacked airliners still in the skies above the United States or coming into the United States. That there were hijacking scares across the country, all different airlines, and that there were closures around the country related to that. They evacuated the Sears Tower in Chicago. They evacuated skyscrapers in Los Angeles. That no one really knew what came next. And so they evacuated the Prudential Center in Boston. And in Toronto, they actually closed the subway, fearing that the subway might be a target for an attack in Canada. Across the country, we just had no sense of when the attacks were over, what the next shoe to drop might be. The second story that I found so remarkable from that day is the story of the maritime evacuation of Lower Manhattan. That over the course of that morning and afternoon, this makeshift armada of pleasure yachts and fishing vessels, ferries, tugboats, rescue boats from the fire department and the police, end up improvising an evacuation of Lower Manhattan of 400,000 people. It's the largest maritime evacuation in world history, larger than the British evacuation of Dunkirk. And it's a story that most Americans have never heard at all. It's a story that on 9/11, no one really noticed at all. And yet this incredible civilian armada comes together to help New Yorkers trapped in Lower Manhattan by the collapse of the towers. The whole effort is overseen at the tip of Lower Manhattan by a single junior Coast Guard officer named Michael Day, as well as a team of boat pilots from the Sandy Hook Benevolent Pilots Association, people who help navigate big ships in and out of New York Harbor. Lieutenant Day talks about how he probably broke more federal laws that day than he has enforced in the totality of the remainder of his decades in the U.S. Coast Guard. But that morning, this just team comes together. These boat captains volunteer their vessels, and in fact, even people begin breaking into the marinas around Lower Manhattan to to break out the big pleasure yachts in the marinas to rescue people and evacuate them from them. One of the things I learned in the course of this book is a good life tip if you ever need to know. It turns out most rich people leave the keys to their boats on their boats. And so they were able to empty out the marinas of Lower Manhattan and ferry people to safety in New Jersey, Staten Island, and Brooklyn. The third story that takes place in the bunker under the White House lawn, that 9/11 saw Dick Cheney in his office that morning. He is picked up by Secret Service agents and rushed down into what is known as the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC. It's a bunker built after World War II by Harry Truman to protect presidents in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack on Washington. And until that morning on 9/11, it had never been used by a president before. Dick Cheney ends up assembling a war cabinet underneath the north lawn of the White House. It is not a great facility to be trying to run an emergency response. They realize very quickly that they can either listen to the government video conference that's going on or listen to cable news, but not both. And so over the course of the morning, they keep having to turn down the video conference to turn up the cable news and vice versa. And then over the course of that morning, a team of government officials, including the Secretary of Transportation, including National Security Advisor Condi Rice, and a number of military aides, end up filing into the PEOC. They think that there are more planes coming inbound to Washington. They know of at least one, United Airlines Flight 93, and think that there might be others. The colleagues that they leave above ground at the White House, most staff evacuate, but there are two rooms that stay occupied, the Secret Service Joint Operations Center and the White House Situation Room. In both, officials believe that they are probably going to die at their desks when a plane hits the White House that morning. At the FBI command post, a supervisor stands up and says, after impact, anyone who survives, go to the alternate command post and we will pick up security there. Inside the White House bunker, they actually go around the room and enter everyone's names and social security numbers into an email that they then send out of the bunker to officials at other facilities, so that after the crash, after the impact on the White House, people will know, rescuers will know who was inside the bunker and who to look for as survivors. Vice President Cheney, shortly after 10 a.m., Navy Commander Anthony Barnes, former naval aviator, comes to him. Commander Barnes is the director of the White House bunker that day. And he's on the phone with the Pentagon, and he asks Vice President Cheney for authority to shoot down one of the incoming airliners. He understands, he's a naval aviator. He understands exactly how serious this is. So once Dick Cheney gives the authority, Commander Barnes asks a second time. He asks a third time after Dick Cheney confirms it a second time. After that third time, Dick Cheney begins to get angry, and he says, of course, we have to do this. We don't have any choice. They talk about taking lives in the air in order to save lives on the ground. And that morning, what is so remarkable about the way that people feel these moments of history is that none of them realize that the attacks are actually over. That Dick Cheney doesn't have that conversation until 10:12 to 10:18 that morning. And that the final plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03. People all through that morning thought that they were changing the course of history without ever understanding that the attacks were actually already over. That there was nothing that the US government did from the beginning of that attack to the end that meaningfully changed the direction of the attacks. Dick Cheney's order is translated down through the military's chain of command to two fighter pilots, Heather Penny and Mark Sassville, at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington. They're scrambled into the sky. And again, like the fighter pilots that I talked about in that opening chapter of the book that I read, both Heather Penny and Mark Sassville are sent into the sky unarmed. Their planes have no missiles. And they realize as they launch that they are being sent into the sky as kamikazes, that the one weapon that they are bringing with them to attack a hijacked airliner is their own plane, and that they will have to crash their plane into a hijacked airliner in the skies over the United States in order to end the attack. They think that they are being sent out on a one-way mission. What they don't realize is that they don't take to the air until 10:35 that morning. The entire day has been over for more than 30 minutes. And that confusion is just indicative of how the government's response unfolded, how the human response unfolded, and how little we understood about what that day actually was as it unfolded. One of the other things that sort of comes through in tackling 9/11 as an oral history, as the story of how people experienced it, is you begin to have an understanding of 9/11 as a full sensory experience. That one of the things that we talk about one of the things we most remember about that day is the visuals. We remember the blue sky across the Northeast, which was actually a unique meteorological phenomenon known as severe clear, the result of a large storm front that moved through the Northeast on the evening of September 10th and left that brilliant blue sky, that crisp September Tuesday on the 11th. That blue is one of the defining aspects of that day. But for the people who lived 9/11, it engulfed all of their senses. And so one of the things that comes through when you begin to listen to and hear and read these stories of the survivors of that day is what 9/11 sounded like, what it tasted like, what it felt like on your skin. The people trapped in the collapse of the World Trade Center, they talk about what the winds felt like as the towers fell. They talk about the pulverized dust hitting their backs, going up their pant legs, down their shirts at hurricane force winds. And they talk about what 9/11 tasted like, what that concrete dust filled their mouths and what that was like. They talk about it as wet socks. They talk about it as concrete in their mouth. And then, of course, there's the silence. That actually one of the most remarkable aspects of 9/11 is the extent to which across the country, by the middle of the afternoon, most of the country had come to a stop. The airlines had been grounded. And people across the country remember walking outside that afternoon and looking up into the empty sky and realizing just how quiet it was. It was something that people commented on in New York, in Boston, in Washington, and as far away in my book as Fargo, North Dakota. That silence in the afternoon was one of the defining aspects of that day. For me, reading these stories, you begin to understand what the day was really like to experience, what it was like to live that fear, that confusion, that chaos, that trauma. And it goes a long way to helping to understand how the day would unfold after 9/11, the way that the US government would react on 9/12, in October, in 2002, and ultimately even with the Iraq invasion in 2003. That the US was just afraid in a way that it had never been before. These stories of these survivors, for me, are so important to remember as we see 9/11 slip from memory into history. It's always hard to know when an epochal event begins to recede from the mind. But there's a good argument that we should make that it's right about now, that this year marked the 19th anniversary of 9/11. College campuses are beginning to fill for the first time with students who have no memories of 9/11. That this fall's election will actually see the first voters post 9/11, that people born after September 11th will be voting for the first time in November. For the first time in American history, we are deploying American servicemen and women to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that are older than they are. This is something that we've never seen in American history before, but that actually the children, the youngest recruits who are being deployed in the Army, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force to Iraq and Afghanistan, it's been long enough that their parents might have actually fought there in the early days of the Afghan invasion, come home, had a child, and that child is now over there fighting. We've never seen anything like this. And the military is trying to figure out how you instill that sense of emotional connection to that day, to people who are heading overseas to fight now. The New York City Fire Department, for the first time, its youngest recruits are born after the day that 343 of its members perished on 9/11. The man who is in charge of the New York City Fire Department, ushering those youngest recruits into the fire service, is Dan Nigro, the fire commissioner, who was the highest ranking uniformed officer to survive the collapse of the World Trade Centers on 9/11. He actually became the acting chief of the department the morning after September 11th, and now ends up 20 years later nearly as the fire commissioner. Of course, he's also had to lead the fire department through the incredible pandemic horrors of this spring. His career as chief of the department and commissioner bookended by two of the biggest, hardest moments for that department. And across the country, we are seeing this moment of 9/11 recede into memory, that a quarter of the country is now too young to remember 9/11 or was born after it. That Generation Z is coming into an adult world today, shaped in ways big and small by 9/11, but mostly born after it. And that, to me, trying to teach them, trying to teach college students like you how that day unfolded and why it matters to American history, is the purpose of writing this book for me and trying to share this history with you today. And so with that, I would love to take questions and talk with you a little bit more about that day, its legacy, and America today.
Thank you, Garrett. What a powerful and compelling reminder of what we lost and gained in an unthinkable tragedy. We'll hear more from Garrett in the Zoom webinar in a few minutes. When it begins and you have a question, please be sure to post it in the Q&A section so that it will be seen by the crew. Please keep your questions short and to the point. But first, we want to share a little bit about Beacon College. Located in downtown Leesburg, Beacon is a nonprofit liberal arts school. It is also America's first accredited college or university dedicated to educating students with learning disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia, and other learning differences. The Peterson's College Guide currently rates Beacon College the #1 school for educating these students, as does bestvalueschools.com. And in the latest U.S. News and World Report annual rankings, Beacon College is rated as one of the best colleges in the southern region. Our anthrozoology program is one more thing that makes Beacon unique. The program is one of 2 undergraduate anthrozoology degree programs in the United States. Let's have a look.
Anthrozoology is our newest major and our newest addition from a programmatic standpoint here at Beacon. This is a Bachelor's of Science program where we study and look at how humans and animals interact in many different contexts. So we look at companion animals, we look at captive wildlife, we look at conservation wildlife issues. So we don't focus on a single species when we work with our students. We look at multiple animals in multiple contexts and really prepare them for a career once they leave here working in an animal-related field of their interest and giving them, assets and skills that are transferable to any of the animal industries.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to record the total occurrences that exist. I'm going to assign you an animal that's in this room, and you're going to actually fill this out, okay? I'm going to give you a time period, okay? I will tell you when to start and I'll tell you when to stop. And you're going to record and you're going to make a tally of every time one of these behaviors occur.
We are the second undergraduate institution in North America to offer this as a degree, and we're one of 3 in North America to offer it in total.
I got him from a rescue in Melbourne Beach, which is about 3 hours away from here. I'm a 3rd year anthrozoology major here at Beacon College. I really love working with animals, interacting with them, and then talking to people about them, and it just felt right.
What I can argue though is that the animal moved forward because of blank, right? I don't know why, right? That's why I'm doing this. I'm being able to analyze it and I can go back and look at it.
If you say the animal remaining stationary,
There's kind of a natural, attraction between students that have a learning disability and animals. A lot of research has demonstrated that it's just kind of a natural fit, and that our student population that we serve here at Beacon College really kind of identifies with animals, and they really kind of share a similar bond with one another. Our students, and our animals just gel immediately with one another, and it's a really fantastic experience to see.
For more information about the college, visit our website at beaconcollege.edu. Welcome back to the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. We are now live with journalist and author Garrett Graff. Welcome, Garrett. How are you this evening?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, in advance of the Zoom Q&A, I wanted to have a personal conversation with you a little bit about your own reflections about 9/11. 9/11, of course, is one of those days in history that everybody remembers where they were. And I remember where I was. I was still a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel, and I had just dropped off my son at daycare and had been listening to the radio, and nothing was different. There was no break-in, so I knew nothing was going on until I walked into the newsroom and saw everybody gathered around the TV screen watching this tragedy. What were you doing on 9/11 and when you first found out about it?
So I have a very boring and quotidian story of 9/11, which is part of what I think makes that day so powerful for so many Americans, is that the details of it are burned into our minds regardless of how boring a day it actually was. I was a junior in college. I was eating breakfast in the dining hall, and a friend came by the table and told me and the people that I was sitting with that 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center. And I had the same reaction that many Americans did that morning. It must have been a small plane. probably had mechanical problems. Maybe the pilot was sick or injured. And yet the details of that morning are still intensely burned into my mind. I haven't been back in that dining hall in 15 years now, 17 years probably. And I could still walk in and walk directly to the table that I was seated at that morning. I could tell you every friend that I was sitting with that morning. And I could tell you the way that my friend rested her hand on the table as she leaned over to tell us of those attacks. And then, later that morning, I could tell you exactly where I was standing and what I was doing the first time I saw Osama bin Laden's photo on the television. And I remember just the befuddlement and the confusion for me of how everyone on TV seemed to know that this was the guy who had attacked us. And I just couldn't figure out how everyone seemed to know that this was who had launched this devastating attack on our country. And to that morning, at least, I had never heard of him. How could someone this evil and this powerful be someone that I had never heard of at all?
Wow. Well, let me ask you this, Garrett. You spoke about how 9/11 changed America, how America was innocent before that moment. How did 9/11 change you?
Well, my career as a journalist has been almost entirely focused on how 9/11 rewrote the federal government. The three major things that I have covered through my career, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the intelligence community, were all, remade, and in the Department of Homeland Security created, entirely in the world after 9/11. And so much of my writing over the years has been on downstream implications of the decisions that we made after 9/11. Much of my work actually over the last 5 years has been focused on the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, an agency that underwent enormous growth after 9/11, growth that was very poorly managed by a succession of leaders at DHS and led to an epidemic of crime and corruption within the ranks of CBP and the Border Patrol that is unparalleled in the history of U.S. law enforcement. And I've written about that for years now as a journalist.
You bring up the word epidemic, and I'm wondering, since we are now going through this coronavirus pandemic, do you see any parallels between 9/11 and the current pandemic, whether it's how the government responded or how America has been changed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that there are a couple of things that stand out for me, sort of one on the government side and one on the American side, sort of the American people side. On the government side, going back to what I was just saying about the creation of DHS, the 9/11 Commission and the various works by Congress and others to study what went wrong before 9/11 resulted in the creation of two new entities tasked specifically with preventing the next 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And the DHS, of course, pulls together all of these Homeland Security agencies, some of the oldest parts of the federal government, like the U.S. Coast Guard, and entirely new agencies like TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. and all with a goal of hardening and protecting the homeland. And then the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or what in the government world is known as ODNI, is a role created after 9/11 that was meant to help coordinate the various intelligence bodies, from the FBI and the CIA to lesser known intelligence agencies like the NSA, the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, all of the 17 different U.S. federal intelligence agencies. And we think of that, both of those, as primarily counterterrorism roles, but in fact, both ODNI and DHS have a really important role in public health, that they have a critical role in observing the world and thinking about what's going on, understanding what's going on in the rest of the world. And DHS then, of course, has enormous responsibility for responding to a disaster afterwards, including FEMA, the agency that we sort of best know for its response to hurricanes and tornadoes. Now, what is important to think of is that basically both of those have been hobbled in the age of Donald Trump's presidency. That for the first 100 days that the coronavirus was loose in the world, there were no confirmed leaders atop either ODNI or DHS. And so in some ways, the US government's response to the next 9/11 was dramatically slowed by the way that both of those agencies were not functioning in the way that they were supposed to. The second aspect that really stands out to me in the pandemic, and I actually wrote about this for Friday's anniversary in an essay in The Atlantic, is the extent to which grief feels so different in the age of the pandemic. That after 9/11, there was an incredible sense of national and political unity, that you saw President Bush's approval rating soar to 92%, the highest rating, the highest approval rating ever measured by one of Gallup's polls. And you saw Americans join together in candlelight vigils and memorial services across the country, and that there was a shared sense of grief and there was a shared sense of unity and resolve after 9/11. And of course, now in the pandemic, what we are seeing is in some ways a much more national disaster with a much higher death toll. We're looking at something in the neighborhood of 66 or 67 times the death toll of 9/11 all across the country, in every community, in every state. And yet the grief of this moment in America feels more paralyzing and less galvanizing, that it has splintered us as a country rather than united us. And I think that there are a number of different reasons for that. One being simply the politics of the moment, but two is the challenge of how this pandemic physically isolates us, that the tiers are the same, but you are prohibited from hugging friends and family members, that we cannot gather together as communities in the way that we did before, in the wake of 9/11, and that this has been a uniquely stressful and isolating experience for Americans to live through this pandemic, in part because there was a certain finality also to 9/11. By the end of that day, we knew that that was the end of 9/11. whereas we certainly didn't know what came next, but we didn't expect that we would see sort of a 9/11 occur every 3 days for the rest of 2001. Whereas, part of the challenge of grieving in this moment is we don't know how this pandemic will unfold, that there are 100,000 Americans alive today, a population the size of South Bend, Indiana, who will not be alive by most measurements by the end of this year because of the pandemic. I mean, that's a tremendous death toll, a tremendous impact on families all across the country that we have yet to live. And you can sort of imagine how different our sense of fear would have been after 9/11 if we knew at the end of 9/11 that there were going to be 100,000 more Americans who died from terrorism over the course of the rest of 2001.
Well, thank you for that, Garrett, and welcome again, everybody. This is the Beacon Salon Speaker Series, and we are with author Garrett Graff, and we're live tonight from Lakefront Television, and now we're going to go ahead and transition into our Q&A session with people on Zoom. Do we have any questions tonight?
We do. Does your book include interviews with anyone besides first responders and the victims?
Yes. So the book pulls together 480 Americans across the country. And it is sort of as representative as you could assemble. It's everything from school children who were with President Bush in Sarasota at Emma Booker Elementary School to military pilots over the skies of the eastern United States, to commercial airline pilots themselves and flight attendants as they responded around the country. As well as everyday New Yorkers, everyday people in Washington, people on Capitol Hill, people inside the White House bunker. Part of what made this project so interesting was the ability to go out and read all of these different perspectives on that day. And there were a number of institutions that did a tremendous job amassing archives of oral histories in the wake of 9/11, understanding that these stories would someday be of interest to historians. And so I spent about 2 years for this project going out and collecting those oral history archives with a researcher from the 9/11 Museum named Jenny Pachuki. We found about 5,000 total archived interviews and waded through about 2,000 of them ourselves in order to come up with the story that the book tells as America experienced 9/11 morning to night, coast to coast.
Another one.
Do schools, colleges teach our students about September 11th?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I said in my talk, part of what makes this moment so difficult is realizing that a quarter of America no longer remembers 9/11 or was born after it. That what you have today is the arrival of Generation Z in American politics, the college students at Beacon and other campuses across the country who are actually, this is going to be the first election this fall that you will have a significant portion of voters who don't remember 9/11. Sort of an incredible change in the way that we think of the American body politic. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to research and look at how 9/11 is taught in schools. I did a piece for the anniversary this year where I went out and interviewed a score of children who were actually born on 9/11 itself, September 11th, 2001, to talk with them about what it's been like growing up in the shadow of that day in an America that was shaped in ways big and small by that day, but without ever actually remembering the day itself. And there were sort of two things that really stood out to me. The first being how little they actually know about 9/11. And then also how little they know about the wars that it spawned. They have lived every day of their lives with America at war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And for them growing up today, it's basically background noise. They know very little about those wars, why we are there, or why we are still there.
Great. More questions?
Would you explain why you think it's so important for our first-time young voters to understand the tragedy of 9/11?
Yeah. There are sort of a couple of different things that stand out for me. One is that sense of innocence that I spoke about, that, for them growing up, they have always known a country that was more fearful and anxious than the country that I grew up in as a child of the 1980s. And that they have, they've never known a time of peace in their lives, but they've also sort of never known the sense of innocence that was lost on 9/11, the sense of vulnerability that began to pervade daily American life. And I think it's really important to try to remember that experience, both so that they understand the trauma of the nation that they grew up in, but also in my most optimistic moments, so that we can try to work towards a society that regains some of that innocence if we can.
We are here this evening with Garrett Graff, author of The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11. Garrett, I wanted to ask you a question. When you were writing this book and you went through a lot of transcribed interviews and you talked with a lot of people, was there anybody that you wish you could have spoken to that you didn't get the opportunity to speak to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I thought a lot about in the context of the story. Is like how do you what are the holes in this story that I need to fill? So there's sort of two big ones: President Bush and Vice President Cheney. Vice President Cheney has spoken pretty significantly about his experience that day, and so there was actually a fair bit of archival material that I was able to draw upon. President Bush much less. And so one of the things that I decided in the course of this was that President Bush was only going to appear in this book contemporaneously. So the only place that you see him in the book actually speaking is speaking the words that he spoke on 9/11, and that sort of the rest of his appearance in the book is actually people reacting to him. More broadly, though, part of the challenge of writing an oral history is that you are forced by the very nature of the project to draw upon people who lived. And so on a day that was filled with so much death and so much tragedy, figuring out how to tell the stories of the people who died was something that I spent a lot of time on in the course of this project. And so what I ended up turning to were the voicemails and telephone calls that people had over the course of that day from the hijacked airliners to 911 dispatchers from the Twin Towers, and then also in the voices of loved ones and coworkers, and trying to remember them and capture those experiences in the course of the day. Because one of the things that really does come through in that context, that when you sort of think about then versus now, is just how primitive the technologies of 2001 were. That, we think of in many ways 9/11 as part of our modern life. That in many ways 9/11 is the clearest dividing line that we have between the 20th century and the 21st century. And yet the technologies of that day were actually quite primitive. And so one of the things that I was really haunted by when I was doing this research and thinking about this was how different the experiences that we would have captured from that day would be if they unfolded now. In an age of Twitter, of Facebook, of live streamed video, we would have had, video from above the impact zone. We would have had probably video from the hijacked airliners itself. And so these experiences, which are so literally unimaginable to us in 2001, we probably would have actually had a really clear and horrifying understanding of what those victims' experiences were like in modern times.
More questions, Ron?
So there are a lot of conspiracy theories. The questioner says that one that she's heard about from a friend, that in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that they believe the plane was actually shot down. I mean, any credibility? Are there any conspiracy theories that you give any weight to, is the question.
Yeah, so I would sort of divide this question, I would parse the question a little bit. I do believe that there is information that is relevant to 9/11 that we don't yet know, that has not been fully released by the government. My own personal questions revolve around sort of two issues where I don't think that we know the full truth. One is the involvement of the Saudi government and Saudi officials in supporting and financing the attacks, as in supporting the hijackers. The U.S. government has moved to declassify some more information about that just in the last couple of years. And I'm not fully convinced that we know the full extent of that now. The other area where I think that there is reason to believe that we don't know the full truth is about the CIA's motivations in the summer of 2001. That the CIA was aware that two of the would-be 9/11 hijackers were inside the United States and had ties to al-Qaeda. And of course, they didn't know at the time what the hijackers were here for, but they knew that Khalid al-Adhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi were inside the United States and tied to al-Qaeda, and they did not tell the FBI that information. And there were some legal reasons for that, some of which were fixed after 9/11. But I'm not fully sure that we know the full truth about why the CIA didn't share that information in the summer of 2001. To answer the bigger question, though, there are all manner of conspiracy theories about 9/11. It was in many ways the first conspiracy theory of the modern digital age. And there are sort of two broad buckets of theories, what are known as people who believe that the U.S. government let it happen on purpose, and those who believe that the government made it happen on purpose, that the government actually planned and executed at least parts of the attack itself. I place zero credence in the idea that the U.S. government had meaningful knowledge of the attacks before 9/11 or in any way participated in it. Mostly because, as someone who has covered national security for 15 years or so now, conspiracy theories posit a level of competence and success that is not generally evident in any other work that the U.S. government actually does. That in many ways, the story of 9/11, as you dive into it, is a story about a government that should have been prepared but wasn't, rather than a government that was so sophisticated that it was able to play some role in the attack itself. Now, I do want to I think it's always worth stopping and taking a step back here and also sort of just saying the reason that we should be so troubled by 9/11 conspiracy theories is the extent to which they posit the idea that the U.S. government is complicit or in fact actually caused the murder of thousands of U.S. citizens and then covered it up. And that conspiracy, in order to have been successful, presumably would have involved thousands of people from all manner of government agencies, both before, during, and after, none of whom have provided any meaningful leaks ever since, and were totally fine participating in the death of thousands of their fellow citizens. And I think that that's a really pernicious and troubling view of our government and the people who work in it. And it's one that I have never seen any basis for believing.
More questions, Ron?
So Michael would like to know how to get your book. I'm sure that will be covered, but he would love to know right now.
Sure. It's a great question. The book is available wherever and however you read books. You can get it at your local independent bookstore, Barnes & Noble, online at Amazon or bookshop.org. It's available as an e-reader on your Kindle or other e-reader. And it's also, I should put in a special plug for the audiobook, which I think the book is good. The audiobook is great. The team that put that together, it's read by a full cast, 45 different voices, an incredible tapestry of American voices, and it contains actually the original recordings from air traffic control, original speeches from that day, and it's a really incredible tour de force if you're an audiobook person, and actually was named the audiobook of the year this year. So you can read it knowing that the experts think it's good too.
Great. All right. Well, let's see. Don't think we have any additional questions right now, so I'll throw one into the mix. I'm wondering, you were talking about the level of sophistication that the United States government would have had to pull this off, and it got me thinking also about what you were talking about, again, about the country being in a state of innocence prior to 9/11. I'm wondering, Garrett, do you think that we have kind of slipped back into this state of ignorance, this state of bliss, that because nothing has happened in 19 years that we have hardened our security forces enough that something like this will never happen again?
So I think there's a yes and a no to your answer. it would be enormously hard for an organization, Al Qaeda or otherwise, to carry out the type of coordinated, spectacular, multi-venue attack that Al Qaeda managed to pull off on 9/11. That we have improved our intelligence gathering, our surveillance capabilities, our counterterrorism capabilities, such that that type of attack would be almost unthinkable today. Knock on wood, never want to say never, but it's hard to imagine a level of coordination like that succeeding with our capabilities today. What you have seen instead is sort of the localization of global extremism. And what I mean by that is social media and the internet has turbocharged the ability of extremist groups to spread their ideology, and not just, by the way, Islamic extremism. When you talk to U.S. government officials today, they say that the terror threat that they are actually most concerned about is white nationalism and white supremacy, that the threat of white supremacists over the last couple of years has grown grown to a global level, really, that they had never seen before. That white nationalism, white supremacy has always existed in the United States and elsewhere, but that it has knitted together into a global ideology in a way where attackers at the local level will reference other attacks around the world. That you saw the shooter in Christchurch in that massacre last year cite the church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina as one of his inspirations. And that those types of attacks are incredibly hard to prevent, because in many ways, and often the case, the person has not actually committed a crime until they begin to carry out their attack. That there are not sort of tripwires that those people would hit in law enforcement or intelligence prior to actually beginning those attacks, and that that type of sort of low-level individual style attack is going to be something that the United States is probably going to have to live with, for the foreseeable future.
Great. Any more questions? We're all done. Well, it looks like the well has run dry this evening, and so I'll put a period on this event tonight. And I want to thank you, Garrett, for joining us live this evening to talk about this event. And we want to thank you most of all for the remarkable work you have done on this remarkable book, helping us to remember and never forget this tragic episode in our American history. Once again, thank you for joining us, Garrett. And viewers out there, again, I invite you to visit porchlightbooks.com and pick up a copy of Garrett's book. They're offering 20% off the regular price. That's a good deal, and it's a great book. So please do make your trip to that website. Thank you very much for watching tonight, the Beacon Salon Speaker Series. I want to thank, before we go, Lakefront Television's production team for putting this together, and Mr. Ron Red for his behind-the-scenes IT work and for fielding the questions from Zoom. And I want to invite you to come back next month on October 13th when we have our next Beacon Salon Speaker Series event. It features former editorial cartoonist Glenn Marty Stein in his presentation, Recollections of an Editorial Cartoonist. For the Beacon Salon Speaker Series, I'm Daryl Owens. Thank you for joining us, and good night.